Distinguished participants, dear all, good morning. It's a true privilege and a great honor to be here in Bologna today, and let me express my deep gratitude to Fondazione per le Scienze Religiose, to Professor Alberto Melloni, and to the organizers of the G20 Interfaith Forum for inviting me. My first thoughts are for the people of Afghanistan. I think of the young people and children, the men and the women. My heart goes out to them. The Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan in recent weeks has brought a new dimension of human suffering to what is probably the most protracted refugee crisis of modern times. I pray for their safety and for some semblance of the pillars of a normal life, freedom, peace, and prosperity for all of them. My own role is minimal if I compare it to the ones of all of you. In my life as a volunteer, I've always been at the forefront of fights against discriminations and particularly anti-Semitism, at least with the association I founded in 2015, Solomon Observatory on Discrimination. In my role, I've been intimidated only because I'm Jewish more than once. Even if I was scared, I've continued stronger than before my battle, which is our battle, and is the reason why we're here together today. Our panel is about racism, and the first question I've asked myself when I received this prestigious invitation was, what is racism? Is there a race? Scientific community has amply demonstrated the absence of differences between human beings, but racial prejudice, race, and ethnic discrimination appear to remain difficult to eradicate. During last summer, me and my colleagues of Deloitte Legal made a research that was published in one of the main newspapers in Italy, La Repubblica, about the use of the word race in the Italian legislation. Although the process of repealing the racial laws began in 1944 in Italy, it was found out that 239 Italian laws still use the term race. France has removed the word race from its basic law in 2018, and so did Germany last year. Today, it would be worth asking if race is not a sick word and try to propose to delete it from the lexicon of the institutions, even when it is used with the best intentions, like in Article 3 of the Italian Constitution. It's a ballast of history, a pathology of language, capable of resisting the antibodies of civilization and knowledge. What a better chance that this international forum to raise again the appeal to the legislator of the country that hosts us, to remove the concept of race also from the Italian Constitution. To quote the Italian Senator Liliana Segre, Holocaust survivor, it would be an excellent signal. We identify racism as an affront to any legitimate religious and ethical approach to humanity, as it has the effect of denying basic human dignity and integrity to all the people in the world. Interfaith dialogue has the important and unique role in alerting people of goodwill to the problem of racism, helping to build the common understanding and promoting religious leadership on these issues. That is why we are asking today, what is the role of religious leadership in combating racism? I'm honored to introduce the co-chair of this important panel, Mrs. Audrey Kitagawa. Audrey Kitagawa is the president and founder of the International Academy for Multicultural Cooperation, president of the Light of Awareness International Spiritual Family, and former advisor of the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict at the United Nations. She's the chair of the Anti-Racism Initiative and co-chair of the Gender Equality Working Group of the G20 Interfaith Forum. She's a United Nations representative for United Religions Initiative, an ambassador of Religions of Peace International, and chair emerita of the NGO Committee of Spirituality, Values, and Global Concern. Audrey, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Barbara Pontecorvo has been a lawyer since 1996 and has a particular interest in national and international political analysis, especially in the Middle East. In 2021, she joined Deloitte Legal as a partner and head of the Rome office. She directs the Solomon Observatory on Discrimination, a non-political and non-profit organization of volunteers that analyzes various phenomena through a legal lens. They protect all forms of non-discrimination inspired by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other humanitarian organizations. The organization's skills include monitoring forms of discrimination, focusing on war crimes, fighting against all forms of boycotts, and blocking terrorist financing. And it is my pleasure to say welcome to everyone here this morning, and I am pleased to be here today with our distinguished panelists and the co-chair to discuss the topic of racism and the important role of religious leadership towards reconciliation. And racism is a problem with a very long and complex history. And while much has been done by many institutions, from governments, the United Nations, UNESCO, and faith-based and civil society organizations, to address the issue, racism remains a deeply ingrained, a substantial systemic problem on so many levels. And the Statement of Principles on Eliminating Racism in All Its Forms, which the Anti-Racism Initiative of the G20 Interfaith Forum issued in August 2020, indicates that the G20 Interfaith Forum, which is a network of religiously linked institutions and experts active since 2014, provides a regular platform for religious voices to engage with the G20 process in framing global policy initiatives. We cannot speak for religious communities, but the IF20 has earned credibility over time as an organization that can help channel distinctive religious insights into G20 policy formation processes. Our mandate obliges us to bring faith and public policies together, and the exercise of that mandate demands a recognition that racism, far from an isolated issue, infects every aspect of human endeavor and planetary existence. The G20 Interfaith Forum, or IF20, Anti-Racism Initiative's mandate is to remain sensitive to the impact of racism as a cross-cutting issue for IF20 and G20 comprehensively, especially in the G20's pursuit of full compliance with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And the initiative assumes explicit responsibility within the IF20 and works towards the eradication of racism and towards the advancement of racial equality and equity by every means possible. The Anti-Racism Initiative affirms its commitment to and support of all international instruments outlawing racism in all its forms, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, among others. And it further pledges to recognize, resist, and repudiate racism in all its forms and expressions, and people are never to be commodified or instrumentalized, but cherished. As people of faith, we affirm the precious worth of every life as an obvious consequence of divine love and compassion. And we are honored to have experts from the various faith traditions with us today to discuss this important issue. And we begin with Dr. Ganoune Diop, who was the primary drafter of the Statement of Principles on Eliminating Racism in All Its Forms, which I had read portions of, and while he was a chair of the IF20's Anti-Racism Initiative and my predecessor. So Dr. Ganoune Diop is the Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Worldwide Seventh-day Adventist Church. He has served as the church's liaison to the United Nations in New York and Geneva, and as its representative within the international community of civic and political leaders. He serves on the Advisory Council of the G20 Interfaith Forum and preceded me, as I previously stated, as chair of the Anti-Racism Initiative. And Dr. Diop is also an ordained Seventh-day Adventist minister and has served as a local church pastor. So please, Dr. Diop.
Thank you so much, Audrey. Thank you for the kind words of introduction. I am sitting because just one of the panelists told me that I was too tall to stand here, so I decided maybe I should just sit. I knew you would remember this, but since I only have 10 minutes, so let me go head on. This brief contribution, I entitled it "A Holistic Diagnosis of the Multifaceted Phenomenon of Racism," and then subtitled "Towards a Healing of Our Human Relations and a Restoration of Dignified Life." The theme of the IF20 could not be timelier. The language of healing has become prevalent in a world facing multiple crises, which trigger multifaceted trauma, lingering wounds, and outright suffering and death. My foundational thesis this morning is about the necessity and urgency to address the pivotal position of anti-racism as part of the aspiration to healing the wounds of human existence, and key among which, of course, is racism. And to neglect addressing this issue and engaging in meaningful conversation, to misidentifying accurate diagnosis and laying out plans of actions to heal our world is like wallpapering of a structurally defective house while ignoring the cracks in the wall and defective foundations. Also, to repair parts of a defective structure while neglecting to fix the foundations that are fragile happens when addressing symptoms is privilege of a holistic healing, which takes into consideration the result of a comprehensive diagnosis and of the real issues at stake when it comes to racism. So we may need first, and simultaneously perhaps, to consolidate the foundation, strengthen the pillar, then worry about wallpapering. Ultimately, the endeavor to address the issue of racism head-on is about healing human relations, redressing structural deficiencies, bringing justice to people oppressed by unjust systemic societal arrangements. It is about restoring faithful, genuine commitment in solidarity to every person's well-being and decent living. And this is paramount. Actually, racism has in many forms been instrumentalized to discriminate, to marginalize, to bring untold suffering to vulnerable people classified as beneath the barometer of human dignity. So the healing then of our human relations, human social arrangements and governance, legislative contracts, agreements, disposition, and rule of law needs the overcoming of the scourge of racism. And its many forms, by the way, such as tribalism, clanism, casteism, colorism, and also classism. So peaceful coexistence in diversity, pluralism, multilateralism faces the challenge of the devastating consequences of human valuing, which result in hierarchical structures, not only functional, by the way, but also ontological, leading to a stratification of society between superiors and inferiors. So the phenomenon of racism then must be addressed in a holistic manner, a comprehensive diagnosis of its multifaceted layers. And this is urgent and actually imperative. So racism is actually a multifaceted phenomenon. I just skip a section so that I can stay within the time allocated. We may need to distinguish between the various layers to identify the core issue when it comes to racism. A pervasive misunderstanding about racism is actually to reduce it to personal goodness or morality, individual acts, and even interpersonal behavior. Racism is more than these considerations. As a matter of fact, racism is an organigram of power, a hierarchical organization of society stratified by means of human valuing, and divisions between superior and inferior. And all this is based on the arbitrary construct, and this has been said earlier, of the notion of race, 14th to 19th century invention to rationalize or to give credence to an alleged inferiority of indigenous people, people of African descent, and people of color in general. In the case of the current context of the IF20, it is of interest to note that racism is at the intersections of thematics considered in several working groups and their respective policy briefs and recommendations. Few questions are in order to really grasp the thesis of positioning anti-racism as one of the key solutions to solving the crisis of crises that racism is. So anti-racism, and this has been said earlier by Audrey, is actually a cross-section initiative necessary to advance the agenda of the healing of our world. Its organic relation with the various working groups of the IF20 can provide a heuristic illustration of its pivotal position. Few questions. How could, for example, religious freedom or freedom of religion or belief flourish while racism is indulged or even unconsciously harbored in the minds or lifestyles of defenders of human rights? Freedom of conscience or freedom of religion or belief cannot coexist with racism. Second point, how could sacred sites, another working group, be even an issue if sacred human beings are denied of their inviolability? We are scandalized when a cathedral, a mosque, a temple, or a shrine is violated or defiled. We are offended when even a cemetery is desecrated. Yes. Should we not feel at least the same when human beings are violated, desecrated, abused, used, and treated as disposables based on the assumption that the color of their skin makes them inferior? Another, how could gender equality, gender justice be framed without the infinite value of every woman and girl based on the dignity of their persons? And I could continue with other working groups, but I need to move on to clarifying the core issue. Racism is at its core a denial of people's humanity. One of the ways to have an accurate understanding of the phenomenon we call racism is through the identification of the various connotations associated with the word dumb. Now, racism is about structure and exercise of power. It is about, and you know, the root word dumb is found in many words. It's about dominance and dominations. Regarding the root word dom, the word dominus, Lord, for example, comes to mind, but also domain and even kingdom. Time does not allow me to expand to mention the word like freedom, you know, state of being free. Christendom, martyrdom, random, state of aimlessness, serfdom, stardom, etc. And I could even expand to talk about empire, right? Which at its root means basically to command, to dominate, absolute control over, you know. So racism has led to claims of ownership, taking peoples as one's domain. What a sacrilegious thought to consider a human being as one's domain, one's property. Allow me to state without equivocation, having dominion over human beings is a crime against their conscience, their center of moral valuation, choices, decision, and expressions. In fact, their very humanity. Historically, this is what racism has led to. Oppressed victims were being considered inferior, confined to deserving or worthy of being instrumentalized, exploited, oppressed, and even subject to lynching and ignominious death. The brutality legitimized through racism is a global phenomenon, by the way. But let me take this a step further. Essay at a holistic diagnosis. And this, again, playing with the root word dumb. Racism, first of all, appears in internalized dominance at individual level, at personal level. And this is like a pride based on the belief in one's superiority. It is a sentiment built on a faulty assumption and pride of being superior to other human beings. So that's personal level. Interpersonal level, it translates into prejudices, biases, discriminations, and criminalization of others. And then the individualized, internalized dominance translate into a matrix of dominations within society. And then, of course, more pervasively, racism is a force that shapes the entire ecosystem of meanings, values, ideas, institutions, and practices. In fact, again, the word dom, it's about domination, it's about dominion in that sense. So racism then is one of the tools, ultimately, of the legitimization of violence. So when we talk about racism, it's not just how you feel about people. It's about institution, it's then systemic, it is institutional, and of course it is structural. So it is impossible to talk about healing, and I would like to end here, without considering that these various aspects, personal, interpersonal, yes, certainly, but beyond this, structural, systemic, institutional, and even the whole ecosystem that we have built on how we relate to one another, how we function, how we think, and ultimately, even system of governance. This is why lawmakers have a key part to play in this. May this forum contribute, and maybe just one last sentence here to say this. In the context of the recommendation of G20 policy briefs and recommendations have highlighted the need to encourage states to continue to establish truth and reconciliation commissions. But also beyond research and expertise, we must move to credibility in reforming systems from the colonial era systems that continue to disenfranchise citizens of every country due to the lingering toxic tentacles of dominance, dominations, and dominions negatively impacting the lives of millions, if not billions of people. May this forum contribute to the global healing of the wounds and traumas of human coexistence. So instead of dominance, domination, may we have creative portfolios of services in the political, economic, legal, existential level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Diop. It was really interesting.
I'd like to introduce at this time Zara Mohammed. And Zara Mohammed is the first female and youngest person ever elected to the role of Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Britain. She thinks that young people are tired of not being represented, and women want representation too. So this speaks to the gender equality issue as well. Ms. Mohammed has an LLB in human rights law, and in 2016, she became the first woman to lead the Federation of Student Islamic Societies, and she previously served as the Assistant Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Britain. Zara, you now have the floor.
Well, thank you so much for having me here, and in the spirit of height equality, I have also chosen to sit down. I didn't want to be too tall on the podium, so I thank the earlier speaker for his contribution to that. But it's really such an honor and delight for me to be here with you all and to be invited. As the youngest person in my organization and the youngest to be elected, I think it really harks true to perhaps some of the solutions of our conversation on racism in the future, which it really does lie with the present and the next generation, because the consequences of the structural and historic and even present-day rampant racism is the impact to opportunity and empowerment of our young people and their inability to coexist. And so I thought I would share with you perhaps less on the how we got here and more on what can we do next. And you know, the organization I represent is the most broad and diverse representative umbrella body. And Barbara asked me, how did you get elected? You know, and the majority of our electorate, you know, our mandate comes from males, you know, a lot older than me. But, you know, the landscape of Muslim communities, you know, this was quite a pivotal and striking moment. And my answer to Barbara, aside from it being a miracle, was that true desire for change, that true sense that we had to take a different direction here, and we needed a leadership that represented not just who we are today, but who we wish to be in the future. A leadership that understood relatability and accessibility, that people could connect to. And even though in my representative nature is faith-based, a leader that could cross-sect, that intersectionality of who we all are. Because the wonderful thing for me is that although I am a female, I'm a representative of all, of all. And we are non-sectarian, non-partisan, and we've been around for 24 years. That's quite a difficult time to keep everybody together. And in a previous conference, I got asked the $1,000,000 question on how do we achieve true unity? Do you really want me to answer that? I've only just started the job. How do we actually achieve this unity? Because what is before us are many challenges, and most of them begin with ourselves, our own prejudices, and the narratives that we willingly choose to accept about us, without us, but also about each other. And so it is so easy for all of us to choose who we wish to put in which box. And that's what racism really does. And to justify that on religious grounds, which is also what racism does, which is this moral superiority that I am better than you, and therefore my treatment of you is fine. It's totally acceptable. And so what we've tried to do in this umbrella is start with the points of commonality. Where can we begin to agree? Where can we begin to act? And we saw that most remarkably during this pandemic. I think in some ways it was refreshing to see the power of faith in action, but also the power of unity. Because particularly in the UK, when some of our most destitute, some of our most vulnerable communities were in trouble, it was faith organizations that rose to the occasion. Did it matter what your background was or even your own faith? Mosques were feeding members of the Sikh and Jewish and Christian or communities of no faith, and vice versa. I know Gurdwaras were feeding hundreds of thousands of people all over the UK. The point being is there was a need and a call to humanity. And that is what this future leadership needs to resonate, that we are here to serve, but we're here to serve unequivocally. And I think part of our next challenge then is how do we break the narratives that are continuing to challenge? And we as Muslim communities have faced the increase of Islamophobia all around. And myself, being elected in this role, I thought, well, this is great. It's a really positive and strong and bold step for Muslim communities to say, we have a female representative. But unfortunately, I faced a lot of criticism externally. Is she really going to lead? Is she just a puppet? Is she just a mouthpiece? Think of that narrative, and then I already have so many barriers and challenges within to overcome, and now you're giving me another narrative around my gender, around my ability to lead. But isn't this what you're calling for? An inclusive and a diverse leadership? So which narrative is it? Which one is the right one? And so I think it's really down to us in this future of leadership not only to define the right narratives, but to challenge the wrong ones. Because as we've seen, and we continue to see, a global politics of fragmentation and division. We already have looked at what is going on in Afghanistan, but we know in all pockets of the world, there is suffering. And in all pockets of the world, race, this idea of division, anything really, hierarchy, superiority, gender, disability, whatever it is, there is an excuse, but there is a justification to perpetuate an evil. And that evil is corroding our societies. And all of this goodwill, I come on the back of 24 years of legacy. One of my colleagues, she's a very senior lady in our organization, she said, Zara, I've been waiting for you for 20 years. I've had the door open for you. And my heart melted. And she said, for 20 years I've been waiting. I've been talking about harassment. I've been talking about gender inequality. But no one's been listening. We've been waiting for you, Zara. And I thought, okay, so I've got a lot to do then. And I think about, one of the first events that I did was inspiring young girls to lead for International Women's Day. And I had young girls from the age of 11 to 16. You could ask me anything you wanted, and they did. And they talk to me about bullying. They talk to me about, discrimination for wearing the headscarf. They talk to me about achieving their goals. I want to be a paramedic, but I don't think I can do it. They talk to me about fitting into society. Should our young people at such a young age need to feel that sense of difference, that we are different and therefore we can't be treated the same? So those barriers perpetuated not just by broader racism, but also this sense that, there are lines between us. Even now in our younger generation, they're still going on. And this is part of our work that we need to do together. And the third thing I really wanted to talk to you about was one of my strategic priorities of diversity and inclusion, and particularly within our own communities, because that's what we're here to talk about, which is how can we use religion? And we don't need to use it, it's already there in its essence and form. That's why we're all able to be here in this room, why we do the work we do. Why my mother always says to me, what are you doing? You would trains up and down the country, you're not sleeping, you're not eating. What are you doing? And I said, but the cause, there's everything to play for. The question I always ask myself is, what is at stake of inaction? When we have the power and the sphere of influence, when we don't choose to act. There is a lot at stake. And what I found works excellently is our ability to use this diversity and inclusion and call for solutions that are inclusive of us all. And that requires a religious leadership that is accessible. Technology has been a great force in the pandemic to show. That calls for a religious leadership that is able to communicate in a language of understanding and of commonality, one that does not increase, that doesn't create barriers, that doesn't create these forces of separation, but actually goes back to religion itself and extends an arm. In Islam, we're taught that, we're all here as neighbors on this earth. We're all here as servants to be of service to one another for the whole of humanity. Yet how can we discriminate against one another? And being a woman in this role, I see that my job is not just to represent my unique traits, my ethnicity, or what I see as, favorable, but actually to look at some of the most marginalized communities within our groups and to give them a voice. And that is what I hope to do. And I've been speaking to groups, small and big, to say, it doesn't matter if there's only 5 of you. You're 5 human souls, you matter. Before God, you matter. Before me, you matter. Before all of humanity. Because that is how our politics work. We play on the weak, and we marginalize them. And the majority say, well, it's okay. No, it's not. And so I think for us today, my closing message is that we have to be a voice for that change. We have to shape and change those narratives. We have to empower and position the future to lead. Thank you for doing that. But certainly, we have to remember that all of the decisions we make impact real people on the ground. And at a local level, that really makes a difference. So don't just see this as academic chambers of conversation, but really as an opportunity for growth and change. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Zara. I recognize myself really in your words in terms of diversity and inclusion, so thank you so much. I'm happy and honored to introduce Mr. Michael O'Flaherty. Michael O'Flaherty is the director of the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights. He's a former permanent professor of human rights law and director of the Irish Centre for Human Rights at the National University of Ireland, Galway, and former chief commissioner of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. He's a member of the United Nations Human Rights Committee and head of several United Nations human rights field operations. Michael was the principal drafter of the General Comment of the Human Rights Committee on Freedom of Opinion and Expression, and he's also rapporteur for the development of the principle on the application of international human rights law with regard to sexual orientation and gender identity. Michael, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you. It's also a great honor. To be invited to the Interfaith Forum is a highlight for me. I think the Interfaith Forum is such a splendid idea. to bring the voices of the faith communities into the policy arena to such important effect. And I'll come back to that in just a few moments. I'm speaking from a very specific context to you. I head the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, which is in essence the human rights advisory body of the European Union. Our task is to support the EU and its member states to respect human rights at least on their territory. And in so doing, we are constantly scanning the horizon of the European Union to identify the human rights challenges and issues as they present themselves. And one of those, obviously, is racism. Racism is an acute problem within the European Union. It takes very many forms. It targets very many groups, minority groups. The Roma, for example, is one of the most marginalized communities within our European Union. The population of a moderate country, 6 million people, who live on the very edges of our society, not through their, but through our fault. But there are so many other groups. And as we identify who's targeted for racism, we have to acknowledge a complex interplay of ethnicity or racial identity and religious belief. It's complex, and there's an interplay in very many cases. On that basis, we're able to observe the particular experience from a racism point of view of certain minority groups within the European Union. The Muslim community, for example. We follow very closely that experience. And, for example, through surveys of people who self-identify as Muslim, we see a worrying and, frankly, a growing pattern of harassment and discrimination. In our latest survey on the topic, we were able to identify that some 20% of people who self-identify as Muslim reported to us that they had experienced an act of discrimination somewhere in the EU within the past year. We also repeatedly surveyed the Jewish community. And there, in our most recent survey conducted just last year, 28%, nearly 1 in 3 Jewish people said that they had experienced an act of harassment in the past year because of their Jewish identity. We've also been able to chronicle the extent to which the acts of racism are exacerbated, are triggered, or are exacerbated when somebody is perceived to be wearing a religious symbol. The symbol, through clothing or some other form of expression, triggers the act of hate. We also know that right across all the groups who experience acts of racism in the European Union, that there's a very, very low rate of reporting the incidents. Typically, only 1 in 10 racist acts are reported. This matters because it means that official figures on the levels of racism in our European societies massively understate the extent of the problem. Everything, of course, got much worse during the period of COVID, where, again, you don't need to be doing scientific research to have seen the extent to which various groups, including religiously identified groups, were accused of with idiotic claims that they were somehow responsible for COVID. The Jewish community has chronicled, for example, how it was targeted, and yet a new round of anti-Semitism was based on nonsense about the link between them and the virus. Now, a word on perpetrators. To what extent are we able to map the phenomenon of people committing acts of racism because of their own religious motivation? Here, my agency does not have a great deal of evidence. However, there's one very important figure we can put before you today. It has to do with anti-Semitism. Last year, when we asked people who self-identify as being Jewish, who committed the act of harassment or discrimination against you, we found no essential change in the answers to when we last put the question 8 years ago. In other words, it was a mixture of people who are from the extreme right in society, people who they just don't know who they were, and people who identify as Muslim. But the important point here is no change over 8 years. And this challenges the perception out there in society that somehow the phenomenon of migration into Europe of people who are Muslim is somehow exacerbating anti-Semitism. We do not have evidence of that pernicious claim, which is alive and well out there in society. Now, if I may turn to the issue of moving from the phenomenon of racism as we see it in the EU towards the role of faith leaders, let me make just a few observations. First, I would like to acknowledge the extent to which the healthy bits of our society, the pillars of decency in our society, to such a huge extent have been built on the initiative and the efforts of faith communities. We have to acknowledge the vital role that faith communities have played in constructing the decent qualities of our societies. It's very easy to demonstrate. If I look at the 5 chapter headings of the European Union Charter of Fundamental Rights, you will see that in every one of the chapter headings, there is a strong value found across all the great faith communities. So what are those 5? Dignity, freedom, equality, solidarity, and justice. All of those 5 of what the EU recognizes as its foundational values can be traced across the traditions of the great faith communities. And so when we speak about religious leaders rising to a challenge, let's acknowledge already how much has been achieved by the investment of faith communities in our societies. Let's also acknowledge the extraordinary role already played by individual leaders. I got into the business of human rights. I got into working for human rights through the example of Oscar Romero, who I came across when I was a kid, and his heroic martyrdom, essentially for standing up for human rights in El Salvador. He's one of many. I think of Desmond Tutu. I think also of Mahatma Gandhi, who was motivated by faith in his pacifist struggle for freedom in India. But as we challenge faith leaders to be the reconcilers, to confront hate, we have to acknowledge the extent to which the public square is closed off to them. We have a problem, and I'm speaking here specifically to the EU setting, or Europe at least, that the public space doesn't welcome necessarily the messages and the voices of the leaders of faith communities. And maybe one of the important things from the Interfaith Forum is to challenge that. Take, for example, my own focus of attention, human rights. It has become an unfortunate reality today that increasingly one has to choose. One is either for human rights or for a religious approach. The idea that you can somehow be part of both has been lost to the common understanding. And this is an issue of concern for my agency. We want a strong infrastructure in Europe for the promotion of human rights. It needs the engagement of faith communities. And so we've done quite a degree of consultation around the issue. And I don't have time this morning to mention but 2 dimensions that need priority attention. The first is we need to invest in religious literacy across the public space. We don't ask for conformity, but literacy. At a minimum, there must be an understanding of the context in which the messages of the faith communities are projected into society. We see illiteracy, frankly, far too often, be it in the political or in the judicial space. And secondly, we need structured spaces for engagement. That's why the Interfaith Forum is so important. It is a structured space for engagement. We in the European Union also have such a space. It's called Article 17, or rather it's reflected in Article 17 of the Treaty of the European Union. It's the basis on which the EU on an annual basis engages in a dialogue with the faith and non-faith communities. However, Article 17 dialogues need to be really, their full potential is still to be realized. Again, something that my agency is very concerned with. But let me wrap up by, I originally thought I'd be original, but let me wrap up by echoing more or less everything Zara said, if you don't mind. Whoever we are, be it faith leaders, be it believers, be it others, there are some foundational elements to the struggle against racism which must be our common cause. The first is we have to acknowledge our own racism, and I think, Zara, you spoke to that. We have to acknowledge the extent to which I am a racist. It's only when I confront that I'll be meaningfully able to engage with this vital struggle. Second, and again I'm echoing what was said just a few minutes ago, we have to acknowledge what we would term in human rights the intersectionality of how racism presents itself, how it impacts differently for different people. Women, for example, experience racism differently to men and typically in a worse setting. And we know this from our surveys, by the way. It's repeatedly reaffirmed to us. There are many other intersectionalities, such as disability, all of which make for a worse experience. Third of my four, we need hard and soft responses to racism. Soft responses, tackling it in our societies, challenging our communities, but hard as well. We need criminal accountability for where the criminal law is breached. It's too easy to get away with a criminal act of racism today in Europe. And finally, my very last point, and again, I don't think I need to say this in this room, but I would say it in any case wherever I speak about racism, and that is effective tackling of the curse of racism has to be an action with the impacted groups, not for impacted groups. It's only when we work together in combating this, as I say, this scourge, this curse in our society, that we'll see any impact for our efforts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. And at this time, I'd like to introduce Jim Winkler, who serves as the General Secretary and President of the National Council of Churches of Christ in the USA. The NCC is comprised of 38 member communions made up of more than 30 million Christians in over 100,000 congregations. As President and General Secretary, Winkler is the public voice of the NCC and represents the Council as it addresses its major priorities: mass incarceration and interreligious relationships with a focus on peace. In 2019, the Council officially added the priority of ending racism. Mr. Winkler was granted an honorary degree of divinity from Claremont School of Theology. Mr. Winkler, you now have the floor.
Good morning. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be part of this distinguished panel, and I thank our co-chairs for providing leadership this morning. Our theme is racism, religious leadership towards reconciliation. It occurs to me that reconciliation has different nuances in various circumstances. Permit me to reflect on the circumstances we face in the United States and how the National Council of Churches in the USA and our member churches are attempting to address racism. You've heard a brief description of the National Council of Churches. Let me add that our council includes Orthodox, Protestant, Anglican, peace churches, and historic black churches, as well as a variety of others. I became General Secretary of the NCC USA at the beginning of 2014. Michael Brown was murdered by police officer Darren Wilson in broad daylight in Ferguson, Missouri, a few months later. This set off demonstrations and protests around the United States and indeed around the world. The National Council of Churches Governing Board traveled to Ferguson, Missouri soon thereafter and met with faith leaders on the ground in order to speak to the situation. The next year, 2015, 9 of our church members were murdered by Dylan Roof at Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. There were many, many other incidents, of course. I attended, though, the funeral of the church's preacher, Reverend Clementa Pinckney, and the NCC Governing Board traveled to Charleston, South Carolina to worship at his church and to grieve with church members. In the aftermath of these and other tragedies, black church leaders in the National Council of Churches said to their fellow Governing Board members that while they are committed to church unity and the ecumenical movement, and although they have been part of the council since its founding, they questioned whether or not to continue participating in meetings and grieving if the council was not going to work to end racism. As General Secretary, I asked why we even have a council of churches if we did not intend to focus on the most difficult issue in the entire history of our nation. I also noted there has been no serious effort in the United States to undertake a truth and reconciliation process like those in South Africa, Chile, Guatemala, and elsewhere. With enthusiasm, the Council decided to focus our attention and energy on the enormous task of eradicating racism. As you might imagine, an organization such as the National Council of Churches quickly established a task force to begin the work. And very quickly, this task force said it would be a mistake to center our work on reconciliation. The task force noted that in the context of the United States, there had never been conciliation between people of color and the dominant white community, so there could not be reconciliation. Instead, the task force said we need to engage in an extended period of truth-telling. Further, the task force called on the National Council of Churches to hold a rally on the National Mall in the heart of Washington, D.C. on April 4th, 2018, to inaugurate this moment and this movement. We named our initiative Act Now to End Racism, and urged our member churches and our church members and our partners to first awaken to the many manifestations of white supremacy and racism, especially in the churches. Second, to confront the need for change. And third, to work to transform church and society into a reflection of the inclusive and equitable reign of God. So Act Now was awaken, confront, and transform. Act Now is a recent call, but National Council of Churches members and partners have been engaged in the work against racism for many decades. Indeed, the very existence of the historic African American churches constitutes faithfulness to an inclusive gospel of justice and peace and resistance to racism and white supremacy. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was part of the National Council of Churches, and he addressed the council in 1957, more than 60 years ago. In that address, he said, "This great body, the National Council of Churches, has condemned segregation over and over again, and has requested its constituent denominations to do likewise. These things are marvelous and deserve our highest praise. But we also must admit that these courageous stands from the churches are still far too few. All too many ministers are silent while evil rages. It may well be that the greatest tragedy of this period of social transition is not the glaring noisiness of bad people, but the appalling silence of good people." Our April 4th, 2018 rally was held on the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination, not only to remember him, but to acknowledge that we have not done the work of confronting the deeply entrenched legacy of racism and slavery that continues to plague our nation. As Christians, it is our responsibility to address these ills and to assert that our faith rejects injurious discourse and violent acts as wholly incompatible with the teaching of Jesus Christ. The United States is in desperate need of a spiritual renewal. Too much of our national discourse is dominated by language of hate and resentment. Our nation's soul is broken. We cannot repair our foreign policy or our infrastructure or eradicate poverty or end racism if we do not address the festering hate so many feel. To do that, we must deal with systemic racism and the legacy of slavery. We must also confront a political movement against a democratic nation that dared defy our long history of whites-only power. This movement manifests itself in countless ways, including the January 6th insurrection that attempted to overturn the results of our presidential election and indeed to murder senior political leaders. Our struggle against racism in the United States must be seen in the larger context of a fight against what Dr. King identified as the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism. The years ahead will be difficult for all of us. Global warming, disease, environmental degradation, religious conflict, and the rise of fundamentalist movements in the world's major religions, systemic racism, the growing gap between the rich and the poor, the emergence of the doctrine of preventive or preemptive war, the spread of nuclear weapons, and other major challenges face us. We have made progress, and this conference represents our common commitment to building and broadening an international movement of justice and peace. But if our children and grandchildren will have a decent future, it will be because we change the very direction of the world to one committed to cooperation, justice, peace, and the end of racism. I am committed to that struggle, and I am grateful to be in it beside you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me introduce Yassine Lafram. Yassine is the president of the Union of the Italian Islamic Communities. He is originally from Casablanca, Morocco. In 2016, he obtained the Italian citizenship. He is the national president-elected of UCOI, the Union of Islamic Communities of Italy. Since 1990, he has worked to include Muslims in Italian society, respecting religious principles and in harmony with the principles of the Italian Constitution and the International Charter. In the pact made with the Italian government called the National Pact for Italian Islam, the various Muslim groups pledged to continue to counter any form of religious radicalism, to promote the training of religious leaders, and to ensure utmost transparency in the management and documentation of funds. Mr. Lafram, the floor is yours.
Buongiorno a tutti, ce l'abbiamo fatta? Mi unisco alla dottoressa Pontecorvo per i ringraziamenti, insomma, agli organizzatori. Io ho anche la fortuna di giocare in casa perché non sono solo italiano, ma sono anche bolognese, quindi sono davvero contento di vedervi nella mia città, nella nostra città, ed è un onore e un privilegio per una città come Bologna ospitare un evento di questa portata. E la città di Bologna non è stata scelta a caso. Bologna è un laboratorio di dialogo interreligioso, c'è una grande comunità islamica e una comunità ebraica che riescono a dialogare in maniera costante con la comunità cattolica, in particolare con il cardinale Matteo Zuppi, arcivescovo di Bologna, e diciamo che il terreno è fertile in questa città per poter coltivare i semi del dialogo interreligioso. E la vostra presenza è un arricchimento per tutti noi, quindi davvero grazie di cuore per aver accettato l'invito. Io vorrei in qualche modo parlarvi di alcuni punti molto specifici riguardo a quella che è la condizione delle comunità islamiche in Italia relativamente a quello che è l'argomento che trattiamo oggi. Il razzismo può avere diverse sfaccettature, l'avete detto anche prima, e sappiamo bene che il razzismo può celarsi in diversi angoli della nostra società. Il razzismo c'è ancora oggi, esiste, anche se qualcuno magari continua in qualche modo a negarlo. Ma io voglio essere più specifico e parlarvi di quella che è la legittimazione dei discorsi di odio, che sono funzionali ad un razzismo molto contemporaneo, un razzismo un po' più soft, un razzismo che riesce a trovare strada anche all'interno delle nostre istituzioni. Perché oggi parliamo di legittimazione dei discorsi di odio? Perché oggi ci sono dei partiti politici che nei loro programmi prevedono proprio delle politiche che hanno uno sfondo discriminatorio basato su quello che è l'odio verso l'altro. Voglio anche darvi degli esempi, non per fare del vittimismo, perché il vittimismo non aiuta, ma per essere realistici e parlare anche di cose concrete. Nelle campagne elettorali, sia a livello nazionale, ma soprattutto a livello locale, voi potete tranquillamente trovare in Italia, in alcune città italiane, alcuni candidati per il ruolo di sindaco, quindi un ruolo importante per la città, il ruolo più importante, che nei loro programmi, ma addirittura in quei volantini che riassumono i loro programmi, che distribuiscono nei mercati, eccetera, voi trovate uno dei punti: no alla moschea. Uno slogan che viene usato come punto di programma e viene usato nella nostra Europa nel 2021, viene usato nella nostra Italia. Voi potete immaginare per un attimo un candidato sindaco che scrive no alla sinagoga o no alle chiese X, e magari può indicare qualche comunità nazionale, etnico-nazionale? È impensabile, in Italia è impensabile, però potete tranquillamente trovare nei programmi politici di alcuni candidati, in uno di questi punti, no alla moschea. Immaginate quella che è l'opinione pubblica italiana, che legge in maniera, diciamo, costante nei programmi politici punti che sono dichiaratamente islamofobi come questo. Questo va a creare nel tempo una percezione sempre più distorta, sempre più errata di quella che è la presenza islamica in Italia. Ho voluto darvi un esempio, diciamo, chiaro su quello che è il punto che volevo trattare, per essere anche più, come dire, più pratici quando trattiamo questi argomenti, perché delle volte il razzismo sembra essere un insieme di nozioni, un insieme di concezioni che sono lontani dalla realtà. Ebbene, noi oggi vediamo che il razzismo ci tocca anche nella nostra quotidianità. E questo in qualche modo ci preoccupa, ci spaventa. Una volta certi discorsi, diciamo, a sfondo razziale o discorsi che hanno una base discriminatoria forte verso alcune comunità etnico-nazionali venivano fatti nei bar, nei mercati, per strada. Oggi gli stessi discorsi li potete sentire all'interno del Parlamento italiano, ma questo ovviamente vale anche per altri paesi europei. Quindi oggi non ci spaventa il razzismo, perché il razzismo è sempre esistito e esisterà per sempre. Non si può estirpare, fa parte in qualche modo di quella che è la natura umana. Ma quello che spaventa è l'istituzionalizzazione del razzismo. è l'istituzionalizzazione della discriminazione, dei discorsi di odio, dell'islamofobia. Se noi guardiamo a quella che è la strumentalizzazione che viene fatta della religione, vediamo che delle volte per in qualche modo non imporre, ma dichiarare a gran voce quella che è la superiorità etica e morale delle nostre società europee su tutte quelle che possono essere le altre culture, le altre etnie al di là delle loro provenienze, e vediamo che alcuni partiti politici strumentalizzano la fede cattolica per legittimare anche i loro discorsi. Ovviamente questa strumentalizzazione viene denunciata da diverse parti. Noi non stiamo dicendo che l'Italia è un paese razzista e gli italiani sono dei razzisti, assolutamente. Nessuno può fare una dichiarazione del genere, però non possiamo negare che vi è oggigiorno un allargamento di quello che è il discorso anti qualcuno, anti altro, a prescindere da chi sia questo altro. E allora diventa importante per noi capire quali strumenti adottare per fare anche un lavoro di prevenzione rispetto a questi discorsi. Io mi ero segnato diversi punti, ma il tempo è quello che è, poi dovendo parlare lentamente per non far sudare l'interprete, io di solito sono molto loquace e parlo molto velocemente, chiudo con un esperimento sociale che è stato fatto e che sicuramente è stato fatto anche in altri paesi, non solo in Italia. Ci sono due ragazzi napoletani che prendono il Corano, tradotto in italiano, e vanno in giro in alcune piazze italiane, in alcune città, e fanno leggere alcuni passaggi, alcuni versetti a dei passanti, insomma, della gente comune. E molti, quando leggono questi passaggi, dicono vedi, il Corano sono misogini, sono violenti, si parla di guerra, di uccisione, di massacri, di genocidi. La sorpresa alla fine è che in realtà il testo non è il Corano, ma è la Bibbia, alla quale è stata messa una copertina, la copertina del Corano. E quando poi questi ragazzi dicevano che guardate che non è il Corano, è la Bibbia, noi abbiamo solo messo la copertina del Corano, tutti questi rimanevano in qualche modo scioccati. Questo per dire che non ci può essere una superiorità etica e morale da parte di nessuno. I testi sacri vanno rispettati, perché poi ogni testo sacro viene interpretato a seconda del luogo, del tempo dove ci si trova, e quindi bisogna dare ad ogni comunità la possibilità di esprimere quella che è la propria religiosità senza discriminazioni su base razziale. Questo è importante, e concludo veramente, per tutti noi che portiamo avanti un lavoro all'interno delle società. Abbiamo bisogno di rafforzare, su questo noi come Unione delle Comunità Islamiche d'Italia investiamo molto, rafforzare il dialogo istituzionale, rafforzare il dialogo interculturale e rafforzare il dialogo interreligioso, non solo a livello verticistico ma anche a livello di base, cioè di comunità, di persone che vivono la quotidianità. Grazie.
Thank you so much, Yassine Lafram. And at this time, we'll open the floor to questions. We are running a little short of time, so but we will entertain one or two questions. So any questions from the floor? So, yes.
Grazie. I would love to hear from our panelists about some of their practical recommendations, right? Is it education? Is it legislation? Interfaith efforts and ensuring that church doctrine that emphasizes equality is emphasized in religious communities, et cetera. What are some of the practical recommendations that our panelists have?
Do you want to have a flash, each of you, just with the recommendation? Okay.
Thank you for that question. And you already mentioned several things. So in the National Council of Churches, we are encouraging local churches to deal with racism within their own context. Many of our churches are primarily white in membership, and so this requires, for example, not inviting persons of color to come in and teach white people about racism. This requires them to do their own work. So there are many resources that member churches have already created, curriculum and so forth. So we're encouraging that. Secondly, on a denominational level, we're encouraging churches to do things such as repudiate what was called the Doctrine of Discovery. This came as a result of a papal bull in the 1400s and provided a theological and legal justification for essentially stealing the entire Western Hemisphere from native peoples. And it forms the basis of law in the United States for the same. This is, to reject this is a very significant step forward, and many of our churches have done so. We advocate for legal changes in the United States in a variety of ways, so we tried to make this both personal, institutional at in the church level, and of course legal in the national level. I could go on, but I thank you for that question. I think it's very timely.
This is really a very serious question. I will just add to this what is happening here right now, that we are talking about racism. I wish it could happen in every corner of the world. Because you see, we are talking about, it's impressive to listen to Jim introspectively looking at American society. But every society has the same problem. And racism is a whole ecosystem of meaning. So deconstructing that everywhere. This is not just about white supremacism, but allow me to say throughout history, we have Arab supremacism, we have other forms of supremacism. So this should be a global moment of looking at how to be better humans. That is what is at stake. And also, allow me to say, we're talking about religious leaders. But religions also, and of course you mentioned this, but all religions have been complicit to this idea. Yes, in the context of Judeo-Christian, narrative and language, we're talking about the curse of Ham, the mark of Cain, to say that black people are actually cursed. All that has to be revisited so that people can be freed from colonial mindsets, that have shaped, again, this whole ecosystem. There is some work to do. So I really think we should not just say at the symptom level, we have to do this, or give me 3 or 4 recommendations. It's deeper than that, so that's why there's some serious work to do. And I hope that this is just part of the journey to get to that point where we, not just reconciliation, but conciliation, looking at really what have we done to humanity. Religions are no exceptions to that. So it's time also that religions repudiate their text that have perpetuated, this myth and basically the way of demeaning people's dignity throughout the world. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think we have to be practical. I mean, when I was elected, I considered the same thing. How do you represent everybody fairly and equally? And I think that's through diversity in representation and in membership. Precisely what you said, James. You know, one of our kind of leading projects is the Proudly Muslim and Black. So we have to acknowledge our shortcomings. I think we have to begin where we failed in the first place, which is to give a voice, but not just a voice, but embed in our own structures. So one of the first things that I did was, you know, I included 8 women in my national council. I increased the diversity quota, you know, Somali communities, Black communities, convert communities. I said, everybody has to have a voice here. And then I did the outreach, and I listened, and I apologized. I mean, I can't apologize for hundreds of years, but I still did, because we have to acknowledge that where we have the leadership and the influence, people just want to know that they matter. So I think in our membership, that diversity in our projects, but I also said it's going to be mandatory for everybody in this organization to have a racial justice and equality training. So we in our own mindsets are aware of the changes we need to make. Then to the outside world, once we've accepted it, policy. And I think we have to talk the language of policy, because policymakers are making decisions that impact minority communities disproportionately, but they're very blasé about it. And so I think we have to really acknowledge what is the impact. And obviously we've spoken, and Michael spoke about Islamophobia is huge for our communities, but it's the intersectionality of it. And as a Muslim woman, my ability to get a job and be employed is impacted by that. Therefore, am I going to be very satisfied with society and that I feel like I belong? And so we repeat the vicious cycle. But I think certainly it's important for us to give a voice to all the parts of our community, to recognize our shortcomings, but to know now that the future will be incomplete without their presence with us.
Again, I want to echo what Zara said. My organization is obviously a secular one, but it's not going to do its job fully in combating racism until it looks like the European street. And we have a long way to go. And perhaps that self-awareness of ours could be transferred to your context. But Mr. Lafram, I found so many things you said very striking. And in answer to your question, if I may, I want to echo 2 things Mr. Lafram spoke about. He spoke about the fact that you can get away with a remark like no mosques in our city. And this banalization, if I may borrow the phrase, of racism has to be called out. There are still acceptable strands of racism in our societies. I mentioned the Roma earlier. It's easy to be racist against Roma in Europe. It's tolerated. It's easy to be racist in the way that Mr. Lafram spoke of. So we have to challenge that. And your communities play such an important role there. And the second thing is, again, you spoke about populist politics. We all know who you were talking about, and it's very clear. I'm in complete agreement with you. But we're not calling out the populists. We're far too much saying they're despicable, we won't vote for them, but we let them get away with what they're saying and what they're doing. And it's corrosive, it's eating our societies. And until we name and shame and tackle the populist politics in our societies, we won't be effective in tackling racism.
No, velocemente, io penso che non possiamo continuare a piangerci addosso, nel senso che il problema va diagnosticato, riconosciuto, ma bisogna in qualche modo reagire. Io penso che le comunità, le minoranze, le categorie colpite devono giocare un ruolo di protagonismo un po' più marcato. Cioè a noi viene chiesto uno sforzo in più e dovremmo fare uno sforzo in più. A livello politico, a livello mediatico, nessuno ti dà niente. È vero, la Costituzione prevede che tutti vengano messi nelle condizioni di poter essere chi vogliono essere. È questo lo spirito della Costituzione italiana, cioè tutelare il diritto dell'individuo in quanto tale e dargli la sua dignità, come è giusto che sia. Però non possiamo pensare che il razzismo, l'islamofobia, la xenofobia possano essere estirpati dall'alto. È un lavoro che richiede uno sforzo dal basso, un lavoro dal basso, soprattutto in termini di dialogo. Abbiamo bisogno di rafforzare le nostre reti, abbiamo bisogno di rafforzare quel dialogo che forse fino a ieri poteva essere un optional. Oggi io ritengo che il dialogo è necessario, è doveroso. Abbiamo bisogno di dialogare per raggiungere dei risultati, altrimenti il rischio è quello di giocare da soli e di non farcela. Grazie.
Okay, thank you very much. There is no time for other questions, so we go to the conclusions. I thank all the attendants very much for joining this panel that I personally found inspirational and full of interesting insights. The outcome of our debate should be a warning, an invitation to no longer remain silent. In the 21st century, in the age of globalization, racism is a part of everybody's lives. Perhaps it affects each of us in different ways and with different intensities. My appeal is therefore a genuine call for action. We must continue this battle, addressing our efforts directly to religious leaders to be in the forefront to combat racism by shaping the engagement of religious experience for a pluralistic and peaceful society. For continuing working together in this anti-racism initiative, we should, naming the problem, to combat racism through interfaith activity, it is necessary to start by identifying all these sources, distinguish them, and act with targeted interventions. Identifying in each country and region those who can take leadership in fighting racism at the grassroots and amongst religious leaders and religious organizations. Recognizing that the issue is national, transnational, and international. Some manifestations of racism are restricted geographically. Other impact on a variety of societies and within and across global religious traditions. Recognizing the stereotypes of the religious figures within some religious tradition, it is essential that racism be denounced in authoritative religious terms from within this tradition are inserted into religious discourse. Promoting and acting on additional strategy identified by the international experts, including where friendship exists, facilitate a network of concerned people of faith who can assist each other in their activity and promote direct conversation between the leaders of all religions. Condemn religious persecution of any faith group around the globe. We must work in solidarity with all who are seeking to protect and guarantee freedom of religion and practice from any people. Albert Einstein, in the message to the National Urban League Convention on Race and Racism in 1946, said, "We must make every effort to ensure that the past injustice, violence, and economic discrimination will be made known to people. The taboo, let's not talk about it, must be broken." End of quote. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. And it is clear from what has been shared today that religious leaders and religious organizations are needed to undertake the necessary steps to change the deep-seated and pervasive attitudes which feed the disease of racism. And we applaud the efforts which are being made around the world. And yes, more of this global work needs to be done. Religious leaders have billions of adherents crossing the divides of race, class, and nationality, and they are often among the most respected members of their communities. They play a major role in shaping attitudes, opinions, and behaviors because they are respected and listened to. And this respect and allegiance have huge responsibilities, and it is incumbent upon our faith leaders to help shape institutional and community values in line with their faith-based teachings, the deep spiritual values of equality, respect, justice, compassion, and love. The IF20's Anti-Racism Initiative will be making a recommendation for the creation of an International Commission on Racism in its policy brief to the G20 leaders. While this policy brief is still in the process of review and possible modification, we believe that healing, reconciliation, and equity are unachievable without addressing racism. We hope that this commission will give central prominence to an underlying issue that in differing forms affects both nations and international relations, and to task the G20 leaders with the responsibility to act. We hope that this commission will assemble a tightly organized, multidisciplinary group of prominent statespeople, scholars, and experts for gathering the considerable collective wisdom that exists on positive action paths forward. And we hope that this Commission on Racism will set out in a widely promulgated document specific principles and proposals that will spur appropriate and urgent action. Racism in its multifaceted forms is the crisis of crises, and racial injustice permeates the many crises that threaten humanity. It is a common thread that, if root causes are left unaddressed, threatens the legitimacy of the international order. Racist practices influence policies and structures that undermine international cooperation in vaccine distribution, food security, and climate mitigation and adaptation. Efforts that address racial injustice reinforce the stabilization of the international order and promote economic development. We hope that this undertaking will promulgate unity instead of divisiveness, equality instead of superiority, love instead of hate, and restore to every person the dignity that each deserves. And we extend our deepest appreciation to all of our panelists and for all of them sharing your views with all of us and on this important topic. And to the attendees from around the world who will be listening to this video recording, we thank all of you for joining us today in this discussion. And thank you until we meet again, which we surely must.